What happens when Hollywood's newest Superman faces off against a daytime television host in an argument so explosive that it ends with security stepping in? It only took 25 seconds for David Corenswet to get kicked off The View after a heated argument with Sara Haines that nobody saw coming. Before we get into this absolutely shocking confrontation, make sure you subscribe to the channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Hit that subscribe button right now because you're not going to believe what went down. Last night's episode of The View was supposed to be a celebration of David Corenswet's rise to stardom. The young actor was there to talk about landing the role of Superman, one of the most iconic characters in cinema history. A role that countless actors have dreamed of playing, but only a select few have ever had the chance to embody. Everyone expected the usual warm conversation filled with congratulations and excitement about the future of the franchise, about what this meant for his career and for the legacy of Superman. The show's producers had been thrilled to book him, knowing his appearance would draw huge audiences eager to hear about the new Superman, about his vision for the character, about how he planned to make the role his own while honoring what had come before. Instead, what unfolded was one of the most uncomfortable and explosive moments the show has ever witnessed, a complete meltdown that left everyone in the studio absolutely stunned and questioning what they'd just seen. From the moment David walked out onto the stage, the energy felt different somehow. The audience gave him a standing ovation, excited to see the man who would be wearing the cape and carrying the legacy of such a beloved character, someone who had captured the imagination of generations. He smiled and waved, looking every bit the charming movie star that Hollywood had been waiting for, making his way to the table where all the hosts sat waiting with smiles on their faces. Whoopi welcomed him warmly, congratulating him on the role and telling him how excited everyone was to see what he'd bring to the character, how they believed he had something special to offer. The conversation started pleasantly enough, exactly what you'd expect from this kind of appearance. Joy asked him about his preparation for the role, how he was training physically to embody one of the strongest characters in fiction, and what research he'd done into previous Superman portrayals to understand the character's evolution over the decades. David answered thoughtfully, explaining his approach to the character and his deep respect for what had come before, for the actors who had worn the suit and the stories that had been told. He talked about the responsibility he felt taking on such an important role, how he wanted to honor the character's history while also bringing something fresh to it, something that would resonate with modern audiences. The other hosts nodded along, clearly impressed by his thoughtfulness and dedication, his obvious understanding of what this character meant to people around the world. Sonny jumped in with questions about working with the director, asking what the creative process had been like so far, what discussions they'd had about the tone and direction of the film. David spoke enthusiastically about the vision for the film, the tone they were going for, the themes they wanted to explore about hope and heroism in difficult times. He talked about how Superman represents the best of humanity, how the character's strength comes not just from his powers but from his moral compass and his unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, exactly what you'd expect from a promotional appearance by an up-and-coming star talking about the biggest role of his career, the opportunity of a lifetime. But then Sara Haines shifted the conversation in a completely different direction. She waited for a pause in the discussion, letting the comfortable energy settle for just a moment before disrupting it entirely. Then she leaned forward with a more serious expression on her face, her body language changing from friendly to confrontational in an instant. She brought up some comments David had made in a previous interview about the entertainment industry, comments that had sparked some discussion online among fans and critics. The way she framed her question wasn't friendly or curious, it was confrontational, accusatory even, her tone sharp and judgmental. She suggested that maybe David didn't fully understand the platform he was being given, that perhaps he should be more careful about expressing controversial opinions when he was about to become the face of such a major franchise, when children would be looking up to him as a hero. The implication was clear. She thought he'd said something wrong, something irresponsible, and she was calling him out for it on live television in front of millions of viewers. David's smile faded immediately. His posture shifted, becoming more guarded, more defensive, his shoulders tensing visibly. He asked Sara what exactly she meant by that, his voice calm but with an unmistakable edge to it, a warning that he wasn't going to just accept whatever she was implying without pushback. The studio audience went quiet, sensing that something was changing, that the friendly interview was suddenly turning into something else entirely, something uncomfortable and confrontational. You could feel the tension starting to build at that table, spreading through the studio like electricity. Sara pressed forward, not backing down at all, clearly prepared to have this confrontation. She said that with great power comes great responsibility, making a pointed reference to another superhero franchise in a way that felt condescending and patronizing. She suggested that David needed to be more aware of his influence, that young people would be looking up to him as Superman, and he needed to set a better example with his words and actions. The implication was clear. She thought he'd said something wrong, something that disqualified him or at least called into question his fitness for the role, and she was calling him out for it on live television in front of millions of viewers who would be forming opinions about him based on this conversation. David sat up straighter in his chair, clearly not expecting this kind of confrontation during what was supposed to be a friendly promotional appearance. He told Sara very clearly that he stands by everything he's said in interviews, that he's not going to apologize for having opinions or expressing them honestly when asked direct questions. He said being an actor doesn't mean you give up your right to have thoughts and share them with the world, that he's still a person with beliefs and values beyond just the characters he plays. His voice was controlled, but you could hear the frustration starting to creep in underneath, the anger at being ambushed beginning to show. The other hosts tried to interject, to maybe ease the tension or redirect the conversation back to safer territory. Whoopi spoke up, her voice carrying authority and experience, suggesting they move on to talk about the actual film and what audiences could expect when it finally hit theaters. But Sara wasn't finished. She cut off Whoopi mid-sentence, something you rarely see happen on the show, saying this was important, that it needed to be addressed before they moved on to anything else. She told David that accepting a role like Superman means accepting certain responsibilities, including being mindful of how his words might impact people, especially young people who would see him as a role model whether he wanted that responsibility or not. David's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He leaned forward and told Sara that he finds it interesting how people in the media think they get to dictate what actors should or shouldn't say, how they should think and express themselves. He said he's not a politician running for office. He's not asking people to vote for him or support his policies. He's just an actor who also happens to be a human being with his own thoughts and feelings and perspectives on the world. He said the idea that he should self-censor because he's playing Superman is exactly the kind of thinking that stifles honest conversation in this industry, that creates an environment where people are afraid to say what they really think for fear of being attacked or canceled. Sara's face flushed red, color rising in her cheeks as her own anger became visible. She shot back that there's a difference between honest conversation and being irresponsible with a massive platform that reaches millions of people. She said when you're about to become one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, when children are going to wear costumes with your face on them, you have a duty to think before you speak, to consider the consequences of your words. She accused him of being naive about the realities of fame and influence, of not understanding the weight of what he was taking on, of being too young or too inexperienced to grasp what it really means to be Superman in today's world. That comment clearly struck a nerve, hitting David right where it hurt. David's voice rose for the first time, no longer that measured, calm tone he'd maintained up to this point. He told Sara that maybe she should worry less about policing what he says, and more about asking actual questions that matter, questions about the film or the character or anything substantive. He said this whole conversation felt like an ambush, like she'd been waiting to attack him rather than have a real interview, like she'd planned this confrontation from the moment he walked onto the stage. He called it cheap journalism hiding behind the excuse of holding people accountable, when really it was just trying to create drama and controversy for ratings. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. The audience gasped audibly. You could hear the shock rippling through the studio, people murmuring to each other in disbelief. This was not how these promotional appearances were supposed to go. This was not the friendly, supportive environment that guests expected when they came on The View. Joy was trying again to intervene, her voice rising above the confrontation, suggesting they take a breath and reset, maybe start over with a different topic. But both David and Sara were locked in now, neither one willing to back down, both committed to their positions and unwilling to give an inch to the other. Sara told David that questioning someone's statements isn't an ambush, it's journalism. It's what the media is supposed to do. She said if he can't handle tough questions, maybe he's not ready for the scrutiny that comes with being Superman, for the constant attention and analysis that would follow him everywhere. She said the previous actors who played the role understood the responsibility, understood that it was bigger than just them, that it was about something larger than their personal opinions or their individual rights. The implication that David wasn't measuring up to those who came before him was unmistakable and clearly designed to provoke him, to question his worthiness for a role that millions of people cared deeply about. David's hands were gripping the edge of the table now, knuckles white with tension, his whole body rigid with barely controlled anger. He told Sara that she doesn't get to decide whether he's ready for anything, that she doesn't have that authority or that right. He said she's acting like a gatekeeper, like she has some power to judge whether he's worthy of the role, whether he measures up to some standard she's invented. He said the people who actually matter, the studio executives, the director, the producers, who know filmmaking and understand the character, they're the ones who chose him after extensive auditions and screen tests. And their confidence means a hell of a lot more than her opinion, more than her judgment based on a single interview question she didn't like the answer to. Whoopi was standing now, trying desperately to restore some order to the situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. She was speaking loudly, her voice carrying across the studio, telling both of them that they needed to calm down and remember where they were. Remember that this was a television show with an audience. She reminded them that millions of people were watching this unfold in real time, that this was getting out of hand and needed to stop before it got even worse. Sunny and Joy were nodding vigorously, clearly hoping Whoopi could somehow salvage this disaster, could find a way to redirect the conversation and restore some semblance of normalcy. But Sara wasn't done. She told David that his defensiveness was exactly the problem, the very thing she'd been trying to point out. She said instead of listening to legitimate concerns, instead of considering that maybe she had a point, he was attacking her for raising them, turning it around on her instead of addressing the substance. She said this kind of reaction just proved her point, that he wasn't mature enough to handle criticism, which meant he probably wasn't mature enough to handle being Superman, to carry that responsibility on his shoulders day after day. The insult was direct, cutting, meant to wound, meant to make him question himself in front of millions of viewers. David stood up from his chair, the movement sudden and forceful, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, everyone frozen in place. He looked down at Sara and told her very clearly that he didn't come on this show to be insulted and lectured by someone who thinks she knows better than everyone else, who thinks she has all the answers. He said he'd been excited to talk about the film, to share his enthusiasm with the audience, to connect with the fans who would be watching him as Superman. But she'd made that impossible with her aggressive, judgmental attitude, with her determination to turn this into a confrontation rather than a conversation. His voice carried genuine hurt along with the anger, disappointment that what should have been a celebration had turned into something ugly. Sara stood up too, not about to let him tower over her, not willing to be at a physical disadvantage. She told him that if he couldn't handle one tough question, one challenge to his statements, he was in for a very rude awakening when the actual press tour started. She said real journalists were going to ask much harder questions than she had, were going to dig deeper and push further. And if this was how he responded to basic scrutiny, it was going to be a disaster for the studio, for the film, for everyone involved in the production. David's voice dropped to a deadly serious tone, quiet but intense. He told Sara that there's a difference between tough questions and personal attacks, a distinction she seemed unwilling or unable to recognize. He said she hadn't asked him anything substantive about the film, about his preparation, about his vision for the character, about what audiences could expect from the story. Instead, she'd gone straight for character assassination, questioning his maturity and his worthiness for the role based on comments taken out of context. He said it was unprofessional and frankly beneath what he thought The View stood for, beneath the standards of journalism the show usually maintained. The disappointment in his voice was palpable, the sense of betrayal obvious to everyone watching. The other hosts were all standing now too, surrounding them like referees in a boxing match, trying to create some kind of buffer between the two combatants. Whoopi was placing herself physically between David and Sara, her hands raised in a gesture of peace and mediation. Joy was speaking rapidly, trying to fill the awful silence with anything, any words that might diffuse the situation and bring things back under control. Sunny was looking between them with concern, clearly worried about where this was heading. Sarah's voice was sharp when she responded, cutting through the tension like a knife. She told David that if he felt attacked, maybe it was because he knew she was right, because deep down, he recognized the truth in what she was saying. She said his reaction was completely disproportionate to what she'd asked, which suggested he was either hiding something or couldn't handle any criticism at all, couldn't accept that someone might disagree with him or question his choices. She accused him of throwing a tantrum because someone dared to challenge him instead of just praising him endlessly, instead of treating him like he was already a superstar who couldn't be questioned. The accusation was designed to belittle him, to make him look childish and unreasonable. That was clearly the final straw for David. He told Whoopi and the other hosts that he appreciated the invitation, that he'd been looking forward to this appearance. But he couldn't continue this interview, not after what Sara had done. He said Sara had made it impossible to have any kind of productive conversation, that she'd turned what should have been a fun promotional appearance into an interrogation, into a trial where he was being judged and found wanting. His voice carried genuine hurt mixed with anger, the disappointment evident in every word, the sense that he'd been blindsided by someone he'd expected to treat him fairly. Whoopi was pleading with him now, her voice taking on an urgent, desperate quality. She was telling him they could move past this, that they could refocus on the film and forget this uncomfortable exchange ever happened. She promised they could start fresh, talk about what he wanted to talk about, give him the platform he deserved to discuss his work and his vision. But David was already reaching for his microphone, unclipping it from his shirt with sharp, angry movements that made his decision clear to everyone watching. Sara called out, asking if he was really going to walk off just because someone asked him a challenging question, just because someone didn't automatically agree with everything he said. She said it would look terrible, that people would see him as unable to handle pressure, as someone who runs away when things get difficult instead of facing them head on. Her words were clearly meant to shame him into staying, to manipulate him into sitting back down by threatening his public image, by suggesting this would damage his reputation and his career. David turned to face her one last time, making direct eye contact. He told her very clearly that there's nothing challenging about what she did today, nothing brave or journalistic about it. He said she'd been rude, condescending, and deliberately provocative for no good reason other than to create a moment, to manufacture controversy where none needed to exist. He told the audience he was sorry they had to witness this, that he'd hoped to share his excitement about Superman with them, to talk about what the character means to him and what he hoped to bring to the role. But that clearly wasn't going to happen, not after Sara had poisoned the entire conversation. His apology to the audience was sincere, his disappointment palpable, his genuine regret at how things had turned out obvious in every word he spoke. The other hosts were trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Joy was speaking to the cameras, trying to maintain some professionalism. Sunny was attempting to redirect to literally any other topic. But everyone's attention was on David as he stepped away from the table, his microphone now in his hand instead of attached to his shirt. Sara spoke up again, louder this time, her voice carrying across the studio. She said that walking off The View because he couldn't handle criticism would follow him throughout his entire Superman press tour, would become part of the narrative around him and the film. She said everyone would know about this, that it would become part of his story as an actor, something that would be brought up in every interview and every profile written about him. The threat in her words was unmistakable, a final attempt to keep him there through intimidation, through fear of what walking away would mean for his career and his public image. David paused at the edge of the stage, his back to the table. Without turning around, he said that he'd rather be known as someone who stands up for himself than someone who sits there and takes abuse from a talk show host on a power trip, someone who lets themselves be disrespected without pushing back. He said Sara had shown everyone watching exactly who she really is, someone who uses her platform to tear people down rather than lift them up, someone who creates conflict for its own sake, rather than fostering meaningful dialogue. His words echoed through the silent studio, landing with devastating finality. Whoopi was apologizing profusely now, telling David this wasn't how they wanted things to go, that they valued him and wanted him to stay. Her voice sounded strained, stressed, clearly devastated by how the interview had imploded. But David just shook his head, a sad smile on his face. He told her he understood it wasn't her fault, but the damage was done. There was no coming back from what Sara had started. Security personnel were moving toward the stage, not to physically remove David, but because the situation had escalated so dramatically that they needed to be ready for anything. The producers were visible in the background, gesturing frantically, trying to figure out how to handle a guest walking off during a live broadcast. Nobody had protocols for this kind of situation. Sara made one final comment, something about him proving her point, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos erupting throughout the studio. Producers were giving instructions, cameras were trying to figure out where to focus, and the other hosts were attempting to figure out how to continue the show after such a spectacular disaster. David continued walking toward the exit, his posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. He wasn't fleeing or running away. He was leaving with his head held high, making it clear through his body language that this was his choice, his decision to remove himself from a hostile situation. Every step was measured, purposeful, showing that even in leaving he maintained control of himself. The studio doors opened, and David Corenswet walked through them without looking back. Behind him, he left a studio in complete chaos, hosts scrambling to recover, and an audience that couldn't quite believe what they'd just witnessed. The man who was about to become Superman had been pushed too far by Sara Haines' aggressive questioning, and he'd made the choice to walk away rather than continue engaging with what he clearly saw as an ambush. The doors closed behind him with a heavy finality that seemed to echo through the entire space. Inside, Sara was still at the table, her expression a mix of defiance and perhaps a hint of realization about how badly things had gone. The other hosts were surrounding her now, their voices low but clearly urgent, obviously having words about what had just happened and how it had spiraled so completely out of control. But David Corenswet was gone. He'd left the view in the most dramatic fashion possible. Walked off in the middle of a live broadcast after what started as a promotional appearance spiraled into one of the most heated confrontations the show had ever seen. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the aftermath. The shock on everyone's faces, the frantic attempts to restore order. But the main event was over. The guest had made his exit, leaving behind nothing but stunned silence and the complete wreckage of what should have been a simple, friendly interview about playing Superman.